Cam, what are some of your favourite motivational leadership quotes?
I like family, religion, friendship. These are the three demons you must slay if you wish to succeed in business.
Is that why people see you as something of an ogre?
I ought to club them and eat their bones. Now, a few more details about this year's company picnic. It's on Zoom, no food will be served, the activity will be this podcast, and the picnic is cancelled.
Welcome to It's About Nothing. This topic today is leadership. So where do those famous inspirational quotes come from, Cam? Who did you steal them from?
Famous Monty Burns, obviously, who's there really should be the Monty Burns, business manual on leadership or management style. I think there's some great quotations from Monty over the years, and he perhaps would get into trouble with the HR department these days. But, there's some wisdom in there, I think.
Monty Burns, Mr. Burns from The Simpsons.
Burns from The Simpsons, yeah.
Yeah, so, and obviously we wanted to discuss leadership, and I think the original idea today was to talk about a couple of different things. One of them was talking about personality, the personality of leaders. And the other one was looking at, perhaps what leaders could do during times of crisis, or just in general, when there isn't a crisis, how can they inspire people and improve and optimize employee well-being? And we have our guest who'll be joining us shortly, Dr Adrian Medhurst.
Yeah.
So how would you compare the personality traits of, say, Donald Trump versus the Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews? Because you'd argue...
Oh, wow. Okay. This is an interesting one, actually. There is an article in this morning's Australian Financial Review by the political correspondent Phil Curry that actually not necessarily compares the leaders themselves so much, like Dan Andrews and Donald Trump are admittedly very different people, but actually compares some common traits in their supporters. So I'm possibly going a little bit off topic here to start, but saying that, that there's a group of Trump supporters that Trump could literally do anything, including, shooting somebody in Fifth Avenue, which I think he, sort of referred to doing once, and he, could commit no wrong. And in a similar way, there's, the sort of I stand with Dan movement that seems to brook no criticism or even questioning of Dan Andrews. So that's it's an interesting one. Dan Andrews and Donald Trump are, on the surface of it, very, very different people, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would have to say. But...
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Yeah.
And, all of our leaders. This is the interesting thing, isn't it? Most of the leaders that we look at today, even from yesterday, are all different in their own ways, but they are all at the top the top of the chain. So they got there. So it's not like there's necessarily a common factor always that tells you who becomes a leader.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting thing to consider coming into this discussion is, to what extent personality matters at all. So for my research background in international security and international politics, there's many scholars won't even accept the premise that personal leadership really matters that much, particularly in international affairs. So if you're a structural realist, for example, you'll say, well, the particular personality of a particular leader at a particular time doesn't really count for much at the end of the day, that what really matters is the different power weightings between states and economic factors and, much bigger structural issues. But, there's a sort of, in politics, we expect leaders' personalities to matter, I think, because the personality surely is part of the reason they got where they are in the first place. It's what wins voters over. Voters don't necessarily have to like a leader, but they have to, be able to respect them. They have to be able to feel that they're competent. Dan Andrews is an interesting case because he, prior to the COVID situation, he'd been seen by many as being quite a Teflon person in some ways. Like his government had gone through, some scandals, I suppose, but his personal approval ratings had not taken a serious dint at all. If anything, he'd grown stronger. And even right now, amidst the pandemic, he seems to still enjoy pretty broad popular support. And it's interesting to consider, why that might be the case.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? There's that, and there's also, if you look at Trump, he has a very solid base as well. And it's like, but the reason I bring up those two examples is because there is almost very strong militant support for both, and they're very different people. And it's interesting, and I kind of wonder what is it that drives that. So back when I was doing I was developing some leadership training last year. And we did a little bit of research, and Adrian could probably add to this later. He might have some, more contemporary research or some different perspectives here. But there's a lot of different leadership models, and you're probably familiar with them as well, Cam, to a point. Like, you've probably heard all sorts of different models here. There's transformational leadership, and there's different leadership styles, and there are some factors that, when we were developing this training, that seemed to be common amongst leaders, or at least common amongst the theories of leadership. So I got 6 of these factors here I think are interesting, and it'd be interesting to test that against sort of today's current leaders. So one of the first ones is around basically what we would call encouraging behaviours, so encouraging other people. Another one is setting a good example. So in other words, setting the example you want other people to follow. A third one is being clear. So having, providing clarity to people. And I guess that's around perhaps setting clear strategy, clear vision, or some sort of clear way forward. So you're creating the pathway to be clear for people. That's 3 of them. The final 3 are setting ideals. So setting an inspiration, that's something that people can get behind and get excited about. Listening and considering, so taking on board feedback and listening to your advisors, listening to your, it could be your party, or it could be your some specialists, but taking on board that advice. And one of the other ones that seems to be, that's common across research, is around being self-aware. So perhaps it could be something like being aware that, you have some of the characteristics and some of the experience to be able to make some very good calls, but being aware enough that when you are actually going to make the wrong decision, or you don't know enough, that you know enough to maybe ask other people for advice, or to rely on certain people to enhance your leadership. So you recognize that perhaps you're not really good on the details. So you have people who are really good at checking the details, and or if you're not very good at organizing yourself, then you have someone who's actually running around organizing your calendar for you and making sure that you arrive at those appointments and that you follow up on things.
Yeah, I mean, they're very interesting. I mean, so these are different models, but, to me, they speak to qualities that they're all really necessary qualities of leadership, I would say.
Yeah, indeed. That's exactly right. So these are more the qualities that are common across most of the models. So there's, some theories sort of say that, the best leader is someone who can almost get in the trenches with you and work side by side, and they're very in touch with, the people who are having to do the operations or the execution. And then you get other ones which say there's a different type of leadership style where they're not very hands-on, but they're very inspirational and visionary, and they can set this really exciting way forward. And then they don't worry about the detail too much, but someone else will do that. So
it's interesting. I mean, I've seen, failure of leadership might be too strong a word, but suboptimal leadership on occasions when, when managers, leaders, chiefs of staff, whoever they might be, are unable to delegate work or responsibilities. So, and in political leaders themselves. So if the leader feels that they have to be across absolutely everything in minute detail, that can be a real problem. And, it simply means that workload doesn't happen. It can also mean that those subordinates don't feel that the leader or manager actually has confidence in them doing their own work. And the opposite problem, I suppose, might be if they're completely hands off, and they're not keeping a close eye on things at all, and conversely, people don't feel that their work's valued because the leaders not paying much attention to what they're doing.
Yeah, indeed. I think one of the other qualities, which is more about being hands-on, it might be situational. And this is the other thing that there are actually models around situational leadership, and what it will look at is that you apply a particular style given the context you're in. So if for example, there's an emergency, then having someone who's very hands-on, very direct, and prioritizes, and perhaps even adopts an authoritarian type approach is a more effective leader. But in times where it's not an emergency and you're actually wanting to innovate and inspire people, then being a micromanager and very conservative is going to obstruct those ideals from being reached.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Like I have a bit of a background in government, obviously, and I'm a civilian. I haven't been in the military, but I've worked alongside the military and defence as part of that, and they have a very hierarchical leadership structure, obviously, and they have military ranks, and the public service has sort of public service grades that correspond to military ranks. So leadership and reporting is quite clear, really. Like, the structure, is literally on paper and you can see it. And the advantage of that is people know who they're reporting to. They know who's responsible for things. They know, for the most part, they know where responsibility lies, or that, we could talk about collective accountability perhaps on another occasion. But I've worked with other organizations in the private sector and different sectors, and they're not necessarily comfortable with the concept of leadership per se, or they want to have an organization with, what we might call flat leadership, where, everybody has a say, which is great. But at the end of the day, decisions have to be made. The buck has to stop somewhere. So there can, I would argue, be a problem with that decision-making model.
There's been a trend in recent years, you might have noticed it as well, is basically everyone's a leader, that approach. And that's an interesting one because if we start saying everyone's a leader, then it almost implies that no one's a leader, because
I think that's right. Not everyone wants to be a leader either. I mean, I have a lot of different projects going, and there's some projects where I really do want to be a leader on that project because it might be my vision of something, and I'm sort of driving it. So it makes sense for me to either be the leader or play a leadership position along with others. But there'll be other ones where I'm sort of, chiming in and offering a bit of advice, and I don't want to actually overly commit myself to that particular project. So if I take on a leadership role, then, I'm buying in more than I'd like to.
Now, before we bring Adrian in, I was just going back to our initial discussion. We've got two leaders that we've discussed at the beginning with extremely different styles.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, so there's another model that's used in psychology that's fairly popular. It's called regulatory focus theory, and it looks at two types of motivation. And actually, leaders can actually generate these two types of motivation in individuals. So the first one is a promotion focus, which is basically focused on the future benefits and aspirations that you're trying to achieve. So you're motivated by some sort of goal that makes you feel, really enthusiastic. And then the other motivation is called prevention focus, and it's basically, telling people to be loss averse. So you really you want, or at least when you feel it, you feel like, I'm doing this because I don't want something really bad to happen to me. And you can imagine both styles basically, like if you've got a promotion, if you're in a promotion focus in a point of time, you feel kind of happy and cheerful because you're headed towards something positive. If you're in a prevention focus, you tend to feel more anxious and agitated because you're concerned that something's going to basically go wrong. So let's say you go off and get some medical tests, for example, and you're sitting there waiting for the results. You'll be in a bit of a prevention focus. You're waiting. You're hoping that you're not going to get bad news.
Yeah. The political animal in me looks at that, and I think of the positive campaign versus the negative campaign. So, you might be familiar in politics, like the candidate may go out there and say, if you vote for me, like all these wonderful things will happen and manna will rain down from heaven and it will be great. Or they might emphasize their message on, if you vote for the other guy, all this really terrible stuff will happen. So you better vote for me. And the truth is, actually, negative campaigning it can be pretty effective. You can go too negative, and you have to read the electorate and the mood and different. Like an electorate might be more inclined to a negative message in one election cycle, and then that might not be the appropriate message 3 or 4 years later in a different cycle. So it really can depend. And another one, I don't know whether this is wrapped up in it, but I was given some pretty cynical leadership advice a long time ago. It was basically unite people behind a common enemy. So if you identify, it doesn't have to be a personality thing. It could be a problem rather than an enemy. But often if you find someone that your group is opposed to, or they're opposed to you, that can be a rallying sort of call. And you see that on a national level where, countries like Iran, for example, seem to use America as a constant scapegoat for all its problems, and that seems to be a political rallying cry. And I'm sure it works in other countries as well.
Is that the saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Is that the concept? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it could be partly.
Why don't we bring in Adrian in a minute? I might just introduce him briefly before he jumps in. We can continue this conversation. So Dr. Adrian Medhurst, he is a wellbeing specialist. I remember when I first met him, he was doing his research in employee engagement, and since then he's really built quite a comprehensive consultancy around employee engagement and well-being. So he's got like fantastic assessment tools. He's also a keynote speaker at events, a lecturer, a real jack of all trades when it comes to well-being. He can also talk to leadership in well-being as well, and lots of other topics. He's got a really interesting company name. It's called Benny Button. And if you, for those of you who watched a movie many years ago called, I think it was called The Curious Tale of Benjamin Button.
It's also a story. I think it's an F. Scott Fitzgerald story from.
Okay.
I'm sure Adrian can speak to that.
Yeah, that's right. Indeed, you're right. The movie is based on the story, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And the one curious thing about that I remember having watched the film was that I think in the film, the character when he's born the first time is basically the size of a baby, even though he's an old man, if that makes sense. And so the story obviously is about, for those of you who haven't seen it, is a person who basically is born old and becomes younger, and that's kind of the whole premise. I think in the story he's actually born an old man, but a fully grown old man, which raises questions as to how is that physically possible.
Among other things, yeah.
Yeah, so in the movie, I remember they addressed that, but it'd be interesting to hear from Adrian why he selected that name, whether it was kind of a random, funny thing like opposite was for my business, which had a bit of science behind it, and where that original idea came up, where he came up with that idea. So I'm not sure, Adrian, are you in? There he is. Oh, look, he's always prepared.
Welcome, Adrian.
How you doing? You got my audio okay?
Yes.
Sweet.
Yeah, good. How you going? You got your surfboard there in the background?
Yeah.
Doing much surfing? Are you allowed to surf during lockdown or not? Is that exercise?
Well, have you not caught up on where I'm living now?
Oh, where are you?
After first lockdown, we decided to turn adversity into adventure. So we didn't have a dedicated office for me to do all of my speaking work from. So we needed to move out from our Richmond apartment anyway. So I now live in Byron Bay. Hence
Oh, fantastic. So you were not in
I moved up here in May.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Fantastic. Oh, so
Yeah.
is the move better? Has it worked out well?
Look, we were going to move here anyway at some point, and we were waiting until the business was established to a point where I could do more remote working, and then COVID gave the nudge and said, Adrian, you must only do remote working. So I said, all right, well, I'll do that from where I wanted to be in the first place. So
Nice.
here we are.
Inspirational, I think.
Well, look, we didn't know how all this was going to unfold, and it's turned out to be really beneficial for a few reasons, and then also problematic. You know, we're really feeling a lot of empathy for everyone down in all of our family and friends. We're not able to visit them, yet at the same time, my daughter's been able to have continuity in her first formal year of schooling.
Yeah.
And we're obviously appreciating everything else that this environment has to offer. So, yeah.
Lovely.
So just continuing the discussion we had a minute ago, we're talking about regulatory focus. I'm pretty sure, Adrian, you did that as well as part of your research, or at least part of it. I can't remember now, but I was just going to conclude by our discussion on Trump and Daniel Andrews. Does Trump inspire people because he's promoting a promotion focus, at least when it comes to the virus? He seems to be very confident and pushing forward to say, hey, you know, it's fine, everything's going to work out, and trying to say, let's get back to work. Whereas the Daniel Andrews and other leaders who are adopting a more conservative approach, almost prevention focus, it's like the message is just be really careful. We've just got to avoid people getting infected and getting hurt or getting sick. And the two styles are probably going to resonate with different personalities. So people who are more conservative are going to be like, yep, prevention focus is the way to go. Whereas the people who like to take risks or are more promotion focused, perhaps are going to be like, oh no, I like that. Let's just take the risk, you know, let's just go for it because there's more to live for and so on. And so it makes them feel kind of pumped and motivated.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, Adrian?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting one. And there's a whole number of directions I really want to go in response to this, to be honest. And I think because there are a lot of theories that have these components that seem to overlap with each other. And I know I sort of joined and heard you talking about different leadership theories. There's different motivation theories as well. And where you're thinking about towards moves versus away moves, approach motivation versus avoidance motivation. And there's not only different motivational theories, but different behavioral change theories as well. And so one that's actually incredibly valuable and becoming more and popular in organizations is psychological flexibility. And so I know, and you'll probably remember Simon Moss banging on about acceptance and commitment therapy, but essentially in that theory, we're looking at how we can orient people towards values-based decision-making and action. And that becomes the underlying motivational drive. And then what's connected to that is this idea of choice point. So the choice point is, do I make a towards move or am I making an away move? And the towards move is towards values-based decision-making and action. And an away move is recognizing that the decision and action you're taking is actually counter to your underlying values. And so I think that's an interesting one to throw in the mix, because what I'd love to encourage us all to consider is this idea of there's the potential risk, let's try and avoid it, versus here's some hope around a values-based and aligned future. How do we move towards that? Now, I know that's not what Trump and Daniel Andrews are necessarily doing, but I think that kind of version could be really advantageous. And I'll just wrap it up by saying this is kind of associated with what I'm trying to encourage leaders to do in the well-being space, because historically the trend has been sort of within the health and safety movement, the traditional medical model, which is where are there risks and costs and issues and there's incidences, and how do we play this finite game of reducing cost to zero as much as that's possible? Well, the health and safety movement's had incredible progress, but there's been a law of diminishing return. It's reached a plateau. There's still risks and issues and costs. And it's because we need to look at this with a fuller spectrum and more than one perspective. And so wellness and optimal health is not merely the absence of disease, it's the presence of wellness. So you need to not only look at reducing the cost and avoiding the issue, you need to look at creating and cultivating and strengthening the good. And so this is where I'm helping leaders. The health and safety movement is still necessary. The risk and cost of reduction and avoidance strategy still has its place, but we need to bring a broader mindset to view what does it look like to move towards, to cultivate, to make decisions and build the best that we can. And I'll pause.
No, do you find, because I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but I remember I was working with a client who said to me, it was a very simplified model, but it stuck with me. He said, as a consultant, you're either a painkiller or a vitamin. And I was like, oh, and he's like, well, you don't have to really sell the painkillers too hard, because people, when they're in pain, they go for something. And obviously a vitamin is something you might have to kind of really describe the benefits to people for them to invest in it. And I'm just wondering, what you're describing there is probably one of those issues we've always got as consultants, is sometimes people come to you when they've got problems or they've got things that they want to solve, not so much where they want to optimize or enhance what's currently there. And do you think, and how do you convince, say, a leader to not look at things with that prevention lens of, oh, we just got to get our incidents down and take away the costs and get them focused on doing more? Or are they different? Or are you saying reframe it?
There's a bit of reframing. So reframing helps in that you're actually looking at the same thing, but you're giving it a different perspective. But the other side that I think is important here is that, organizations have resources that they need to utilize to meet the demands that are on their plate. Now, not all demands are bad and not all demands are created equal. Demands are just the things that require capital investment and human capital, the resource allocation, people's energy, time, skills, and so forth. So you need to use your resources to meet the demands. The demands are what the customer needs, your business goals in terms of strategic objectives and where you want to get to and so forth. But where I say demands aren't created equally, some of the demands that people have, that your resources have, are really meaningful challenges. And even though they're hard and they require a lot of effort and human resource, if you're matching up the right resources to meet those challenges, then you're going to be helping people utilize their strengths to work towards outcomes. The other type of demand is the harder one. It's the hindrances. It's the things that create friction, bureaucracy, conflict, the spillover effect of work to life. And so we need to identify how to remove the friction and the hindrance, and in fact match up the resources to the meaningful challenges. And when that starts coming together, it's incredibly valuable. And so whilst you're right that there's this reframing of, well, what's a different perspective that we could take on this? It's also worthwhile distinguishing between something that otherwise gets branded with the same label and saying, well, they're not all like that. And so another word that gets that is stress. Health impairment, or some things that the media and research says this is bad for you. That's too much of a broad brush stroke across something that actually when you look at it like this and when you handle stress in this way, it's actually powerfully positive for our growth and our strengthening our immune system and so on. Some of the stress we should be appropriately labeling as distress, as harmful. So there's these ideas that not only fit, I think, organizationally, which is obviously where our discipline is, or mine, our discipline is. But what does this look like if we're thinking about leaders of bigger, different types of organizations, social structures, communities, like the world? So I think I'm curious in this call as to what are the theories that we know that might pitch up to this kind of discussion you're having.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind is a test of leadership is how one responds to advice and takes advice. And this sort of conversation about if you're consulting, and I'm a consultant now, and I've been a political advisor in the past, and often you can fall into this trap as an advisor of giving advice not giving advice that isn't welcome, and then ultimately, if you do that, you're not doing your job essentially. But I wonder if that's without either of you sort of divulging any confidences, is that a struggle that you've found? Like, if you know that you're advising, consulting in a certain direction, and you know that advice isn't perhaps going to be welcomed, how do you respond to that?
I've got a really probably quite relevant example, to be honest, because Nick introduced that I've been doing this work for a long time. My doctoral thesis was initially on engagement, but I was really looking at optimal functioning. And so my models look not only at engagement, but also the theory of flow, where people have peak experiences, and how these states can contribute not only to optimal performance outcomes, but also not be to the detriment of their well-being. So people aren't burning out under high performance, they're actually thriving.
Yeah.
But the interesting piece, I think, in fact, I'll let you dive in to this, Nick, and I'll come back to it, because I want to shape up my thoughts to make sure that I don't ramble too much again.
I was enjoying seeing where you were going, but we'll come back.
So I think what you're saying, Cam, is like, what if you want to provide advice to a leader or just to a client or something, and they might not be ready to hear the advice, or they don't want to hear bad news, or is that sort of thing? And like, do they?
Yeah, it can be that. I mean. Yeah. So without going into the weeds too much, if you're a political advisor, for example, the chances are you're working in a party political environment. So groupthink can be a real problem. So you might be like gaming out a strategy with a team of advisors with a boss, and you might obviously see an error in their logic, or you might be a naturally contrarian person and put a different point of view. That's not always welcome, obviously. So you've got to sort of decide how you navigate that. And in my experience, a lot of it's about picking your battles. If it's a fairly, transactional thing that doesn't matter much at the end of the day, you're better off not pushing your point. If it's something that you believe in personally very strongly, that's different, obviously. If it's something that you feel is just a bad idea, then I think it is obligated on you to sort of speak up, but it can be challenging.
I think you're ultimately, it's hard to have a general rule about it, but I think ultimately it's about influence, is what you're talking about, which is what everyone's doing all the time. We're always trying to influence outcomes in a particular way. And I think you're exactly right. It's like, which things really matter. Like, you don't want to necessarily spend a whole heap of time going over something that's not going to have a huge difference just to get your way for the sake of it. And then I think the I guess the people who are good at influencing ultimately don't do it in a way that's just the one size fits all. They don't just say, oh, I'm just going to just be really vocal about it. That's my strategy. I guess some people will adopt a strategy. They'll go, I'll chip away at this, and I'll take smaller battles over time, and I'll keep working at it. Other people might work through another person, so they might influence another person to influence that other person, and so on. So there's so many different strategies for that. And the funny thing is, not just as a consultant, I think everyone is doing this all the time. The whole world is just surrounded by people trying to influence. It could even be just family members or your kids, or it's basically what human beings do all the time. It's not just about receiving or not receiving advice.
It's interesting. I mean, I remember one case. I've seen one minister come into, without mentioning names, come into government and take over responsibility of a particular department, and then have a relationship with that department's bureaucracy, and push back very, very quickly on some minor transactional things, because that minister wanted to establish their authority So if you look at the particular issue, they didn't really amount to a hill of beans at the end of the day, but because it was sort of week 1, week 2 of that minister being in that job, that was their way of sending a message that, no, I'm not going to let this go through, because in 6 months' time, when you try and push something really big through that I don't want to happen, or I want at least to have more of a say on, I'll be letting myself down. So that's quite interesting. Like there is that, I'm not advocating it at all. There is quite an uncompromising model of leadership where, some people just won't budge any ground whatsoever.
Indeed. Adrian, what were your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I'll start at the start now and trace back to the extent necessary. But what this related to for me was that I spent a fair bit of time after research in consulting, essentially trying to say, hey, I've done all this research, and people analytics, understanding your people by being able to capture better data, is an area of our discipline that we become good at. And it was an area in human resource management that was needed because they didn't have as compelling data at the time. So I was in there trying to influence leaders of the opportunity for them to actually see their people data better and to see the impact of the interventions that they're having. And what was interesting is here I am pushing my agenda, saying, I'm like Zorro, I'm here to save the day. And I thought it was all upside. But what I was met with was, hang on a second. So now you're going to show me my data in a way that I can more defensively see whether or not what I'm doing is good and working, or whether it's not.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah. And that was too threatening.
Yeah. Okay.
So
yeah.
And I was struggling with that early in my career until I realized that you need to, and this is the whole educate the market, you need to help people recognize the place that it has, and where it's not just about doing, it's what's the risk of not doing. And it's at that point that I realized that I couldn't just talk about that strength-based opportunity side without saying, you've still got issues that you haven't been able to solve.
Yeah.
And so we need to look at that side, but we also can start to explore this side of the spectrum as well. Yeah. And that led to much more receptivity.
I suspect, I mean, you can correct me, but this is partly a dilemma of consulting. Like, I don't know this particular organization's one that you sort of came into, and then like, so you come in with a model that works, it's a good model, but people in that organization can be a bit defensive because they might feel that, well, you don't know their organization, they don't know the model. So it's your job obviously to sell the model, but the model should speak for itself. They may have had other negative experiences with consulting. Like sometimes you have to sell to people what to do.
And the latter happens quite a lot. I've often had to go in and do damage control. And then, how we're talking about needing to communicate and influence, sometimes it's actually, in a way, relabeling something so that people can be receptive to it again.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. Resilience training. So I'm in the wellbeing space. Resilience training. Many employees received resilience training as a signal from the business that it's your issue and we're going to help you toughen up.
Okay.
As opposed to, we've got problematic work design that's causing undue pressure, and we're going to try and alleviate that suffering or the hindrances, and at the same time give you some skills that will strengthen how you engage and work through setbacks and periods of struggle. Now that's a very different proposition.
Yeah, that's
unfortunately,
that's a negative one, right?
Yeah. But and as an example, if a business has a failed attempt at resilience training, and even wellbeing training for that matter, where someone has come in and delivered something that's overly fluffy and flowery and happyology and not really science-based or effective, and they can be resistant to or mistrusting. They look at your model, how is that different? And you've almost got an uphill battle in some scenarios.
Yeah, I imagine sometimes too, people are pretty comfortable and they don't want something to be changed.
Don't rock the boat.
They like it
the status quo. Yeah.
I can understand that. Yeah.
Adrian, I think that's interesting that you mentioned that. I like your analogy with Zorro and sort of coming in to save the day. I think that's an interesting one. It reminds me of something that we were discussing with a colleague of mine who was talking about archetypes and the different archetypal stories that we tell ourselves. And for those unfamiliar with archetypes, we're talking about things like the hero's journey. There's certain characters that you can look at across time in various stories and in culture and even in our own lives, where you can almost label them a particular archetype, and that might be, the hero, and you can have the kind of the wise old man. If you think about like all the classic stories, you got the wise old man is like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, is Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, and so on. And then of course there's lots of others. There's things like there's a character called the magician who's like Merlin, and they're actually usually around disruption and transformation, like people who are very powerful and can completely shake the foundations. And so this one of these consultants who I worked with was talking about, what role are you playing if you're an advisor and you're a consultant? Are you the hero? Are you the Zorro in the story, or are you not actually the hero in this story? You're actually the advisor or another character. And then identifying what that role is to that person that you're working with is actually really important. It doesn't mean you have to go through an archetypal kind of analysis, but it seems,
yeah. Do you know what's funny? Because I threw out the Zorro example, and there's actually a bit that's behind that anyway. So I can't be credited with the whole Zorro example. Instead, Matt Church from a business school that I ended up entering into called Thought Leaders Business School, we learned different ways that you can communicate ideas, and as an quote unquote expert, how you can not only work through intellect or models and the specifics of variables and science and stats, but you can also appeal to storytelling and the more emotive side, and these archetypes or the characters that you might embody can really help. And in acting as a metaphor, it's just giving people a different way to understand what it is that you're about. But the Zorro example is an interesting one, because here, and this is how I connected to it, in the way that Matt would talk about it, Zorro would arrive at the village and say, I'm here to save the day. And if the village says, we're right, mate, then you go, cool, I'll go to another village. So it was almost to not take the wind out of your sails as an advisor, where you've got conviction in what it is that you're offering. If someone says no, you don't necessarily change what it is that you're doing. You just realize that there's another village that needs help, and you go there.
The comment this person was telling me was that everyone is basically a hero in their own story. That's the other thing to always recognize. So let's say, Adrian, you go and talk to a coach and you want some coaching, then a good coach will recognize that they're not going to spend the whole session talking about themselves and inflating their own ego. They'd be looking at you as, you're the hero in this story. What can I do to help you move forward? And I'm just wondering, Cam, does that kind of does that actually align with any of your experience working in government and with those particular advisors, the really good ones? Are they good at helping, I guess, the leaders transform their hero story in a way?
Yeah, I think political advising is quite unique in a way, because it's a very personal thing. Like if it's done well, so if you're working for a minister or a member of parliament, your first duty really is to that person and to kind of protecting them and advancing their interests, and even to them personally more than the actual party they represent. This is where politics gets interesting. Like I remember the first job I ever had, someone gave me some advice about loyalty, and I thought they were talking about being wary of the opposition, the other party, but they actually meant be careful of the other officers. So, people might, if you're a young advisor, someone from another office might take you out for coffee and ask you what you're working on in a really sort of friendly way. And you learn pretty quickly to be careful of things like that. And your first duty is to your boss in that sense. And we used to often talk about protecting the talent or letting the talent shine. So there's a frustration when you're a speechwriter, for example. You write all these really great lines, or hopefully great lines, and your boss goes out there and gives them, but you don't take any credit for that, obviously. Like you let them shine. But the complication of it is obviously, like, you have to maintain a level of objectivity. So you've got a personal loyalty to that boss, but you have to be prepared to give them advice that they don't, necessarily want to hear, or even call them out privately, in the right way if you think that they're making a mistake or making a misjudgment. And you have to have a relationship with them where they're quite open with you about, what they're doing. Like if your minister your boss isn't sort of confiding in you and taking you into their confidence, you're not really able to effectively perform your role.
Adrian, when you were mentioning these sort of programs where the sort of really short, sharp resilience program or wellbeing program, and I sympathise with what you're saying, because I think what you're getting at is, it may actually be done with the best of intentions, those things, but people read subtext into it anyway, and they might just think, oh, that's, this is being put back on me. But is there, like, I'm just putting myself in the shoes of someone who's working in an organisation, like, let's say you're leading an organisation with 200 people, and you're worried about well-being and resilience. So you're a leader in this situation, and maybe the thought process for, say, like the managing director or one of the executives is, I want to bring everyone together, including the managerial level leaders who are making lots of decisions. And I want to use this as a catalyst so that they go off and actually consider making changes. And I wonder, is the issue more that they just don't really necessarily understand what kind of systemic changes they can actually make? Because it's not always that simple to say, well, we've designed the workplace this way and we've made it really hard on people. Because usually I think most people are really open to the idea of, if we could simplify and improve things, and we would do it. But they usually sort of stuck with, this is really complicated. It's not that easy for me to suddenly change productivity pressure or anything like that, because I'm under other pressures as well. So I don't think I have a question. I'm sounding like, I think like Peter Credlin in the press conference the other day, where I'm making a statement, I think, the Daniel Andrews one. But I'm not sure if I have a question other than I guess maybe the question is, what can the managing director actually do as a leader? Like, what's one thing they can do differently, do you think, that would make all the difference?
So way to turn it. You move from a whole lot of stuff that I could explore to a really, really tough question.
Well, because I think sometimes
That's all right.
people have got to make a choice between so many things, and you get in a situation where you're given so much advice by so many different people. So some people will be saying to you, we've got to do much more innovation. Innovation's the key, and they want to put much more investment in there. And then another person's saying, let's do lots of well-being, and let's get the employee well-being. And then another person's saying, let's understand our customers better. We don't really understand our customers. There's so many things you can focus your attention on today. And I guess what's the case for going, well-being is the thing you've really got to focus on. And it's not to say the other things aren't important, but if they were to make a significant change, would you start with, at the very least, we've got to start doing some measurement of this so we at least understand it. Is that the first thing?
Yeah, essentially, because you're right that these things, there's systems, they're interrelated, and measurement's really important, but you also shouldn't set the unrealistic expectation that you'll be able to measure everything and that you'll be able to really defend causal relationships between the things that you explore. But if you do look at as many of the really necessary components of the system into a model, and you can pull together what the overarching story looks like, it'll give you a better sense of, okay, well, we've got a few really important levers here, and we can prioritize the extent to which we invest certain amount of time and effort and energy in this bit, but not all of it, because we need some for over here, as an example. What leaders can tend to want, though, is the silver bullet. What's that one thing? And in fact, sometimes what they're wanting their analysis to turn into is just give me that number, give me that one thing. And that was something that I really bucked up against when I was doing my research. I ended up doing quite complex data modeling because I was interested in systems of variables and how they work together, and how a system of variables can be defended as a unit, but that would also influence other systems of variables. And then bigger modeling gives you a more complete understanding of what's going on. You're getting closer to reality. And I think that that's really, really important. And I'll link it back to the sort of the well-being story here by referencing Jeffrey Pfeffer's work. So my research was in high involvement work systems and high performance HR practices and systems. And I referenced a lot of his research, but he got frustrated that as an academic, he could look at scientifically what system you needed to create, but get very frustrated that that wasn't being executed and embedded within organizations well enough. And it was because he could promote the good, sort of coming back to what I've been saying, he could promote the good, but if they weren't similarly addressing the hindrance forces, then the good wasn't able to have its best impact and to get embedded. So you need to very much always be looking at this full spectrum approach. I'll cut into it with some really basic words. Create healthiness, promote well-being, but make sure that you're addressing the illness risks. And so from a work design perspective, you can't just provide people with well-being perks. You need to identify if there are hindering components that are creating a significant effect on people, then you need to look at both. Build the good, address the bad.
Okay. My experience with when I worked in organisations, when I had a real job back in back in the day, was that the thing that was most distressing for a person's well-being, including my own or anyone I observed, was always came down to a relationship issue, which might be it could be like a bully or someone in the workplace, or it could be someone or a manager or a leader who is very adversarial and difficult and create a lot of tension. So like, for instance, I worked in workplaces where, that would be quite common for people to be, yelling at each other, not all the time, but there'd be certain leaders in that organization who would, perhaps yell or at least be really forceful and sometimes it would feel like you were going to the principal's office to see them, that kind of feeling. Yeah, wow. And just, observing that and I'm just wondering, is that, you were mentioning that the leader has to look at almost like the underlying things that are causing some of these problems. Do you think, and it's probably hard to make a general statement about generally, but is it relationships usually that are going to be the problem, or is there something else that crops up more often, do you think, that is more important? Like what are the usual suspects, you think, in workplaces that cause issues with health and well-being?
Yeah, look, there are a lot, but I think the relationships one's a really interesting one to point to, because if we're thinking about where's a good leverage point to think about this sort of area of relationships can open up a whole lot of types of relationships or relationship issues that might be the problem. So as an example, if someone is already very clear on what their strengths are and they know what they find meaningfully challenging and fulfilling, if they're not able to influence relationships to the extent that they can unlock their potential by doing that stuff that they know how to do, then that can be what causes frustration, disengagement, cynicism, and so forth for that employee. So this is the talented person that just wants to be provided with more autonomy and the opportunity, and it's through the relationship influence that they want to be able to get there. But there are other people that, for instance, will feel stuck or frustrated, but it's because they don't they don't really know what it is that would enable them to fulfill their potential. Or maybe they don't have a belief that they could craft that for themselves. So one is the hungry person that's frustrated that they can't influence, and the other is the person that hasn't been given the opportunity to be aware of what good could look like, if that makes sense. And there's a large number of people that are essentially, okay, but would not necessarily know what it would look like or feel like to be exploring their potential.
If we're dealing with a bad workplace culture, what do we do if the leader or the leadership team is basically part of the problem? It's hard, right? I'm talking about just a general question. I suppose there's different responses. Yeah.
I was trying to find a word that doesn't sound harsh, but it's because look, it does happen in the work that I do that bad leadership gets exposed.
Yeah,
there are
part of the process.
Yeah. And I mean, as an example, I had an organization where they believed they needed a particular type of wellbeing intervention. I said, that sounds interesting. What evidence do you have that that's the right thing for this group? And they said, we just kind of finger in the breeze. We think that sounds about right. And we said, well, let's do a review. And in doing a review, we were able to actually break down the group into some different component parts. Yeah. And as it turned out, there was a very different thing that was needed over here than over here. And there was a very clear issue that wasn't about work and life well-being and reaching potential, though these two were through different pathways that could be realized. The central team was, oh my gosh, we've got a really big issue around leadership and culture in that particular area. And it actually had people that were close to that group saying, yeah, we kind of knew that there was something going on, but with a review and the right data, removing the blind spots, because there are a lot of blind spots in organizations with incomplete data, was able to offer that intelligence for wiser decisions and investment of time in the right interventions for the right groups.
So they're receptive to that. That's great. That's a good news story.
Well, but an example is that they didn't necessarily know what they were going to find. Now, in finding that and finding it valuable, that's a success story. But imagine a different scenario where we come in and we expose something that they feel incredibly threatened by. Yeah. Then that could close the door for more work.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that can be a problem. You can talk yourself out of an account, possibly.
There was an interesting story about the Ellen DeGeneres show. Were you following that? And they revealed a lot of previous people who'd worked there previously were revealed that there was a toxic culture and they were being harassed and bullied and alleged that Ellen herself was doing things, whether it's true or not, wasn't making eye contact with people, was instructing people not to make eye contact with her, and she of course has denied all of those things, not the culture, but things like that. And I think when you look at a scenario like that one, you definitely look at something that could have started okay, and then it goes off the rail in such a slow way and over time that it gets out of hand and people get used to it. So it's not always that a leader or a group of leaders or even individuals within a workplace have actually just made a decision to do certain things. That's the slow creep and the danger of culture is it doesn't happen in a logical way. It happens almost like an organism that's growing. It changes. Yeah. And before you know it, you're looking around and you're going, how do we get in this mess?
Yeah. I mean, think about this scenario with the Ellen one. And I really don't know much about it, but I know of it. But let's speculate for a second and link it back to some of the comments from before around working in government agencies and need to be careful who you talk to over coffee about what. But imagine around Ellen, there's a team that wants to have their needs met. And so they start to push down to others that might be getting Ellen's attention. No, you can't do this. She doesn't like that. You have to wait in line. Now, it could have had nothing to do with Ellen.
Yeah, indeed.
And I'm not saying that that's the case, but I mean, I'm just saying.
Yeah, often it's the gatekeeper around the leader that can be the difficult person to deal with. Certainly not always, but they feel that they need to perform a certain role, and there must be certain parallels between politics and Hollywood in some ways, like ego. They say politics is show business for ugly people, right? So there's got to be some parallels there.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? One of the other things I wanted to discuss, and it was alluding to the fascination with people like Trump, is something that's often not talked about a lot, actually, is when he was like running for president right at the beginning. It seemed to me that the fact that he was actually a Hollywood icon, or at least a celebrity, wasn't really, I mean, it was almost like people didn't talk about it because it was obvious, but it seems that in hindsight, the fact that you're an entertainer and you've been working in the entertainment industry says something immediately, that what people like is to be entertained, and whether great leaders actually are good at entertaining the people who they're working with. And I don't mean in a superficial way necessarily. It could just be they're entertaining because they're inspiring. It could be entertaining because they've got a good use of humor and they make people feel at ease. And
I think it's energy as well. And like, I know one politician I'm familiar with has a certain level of energy and charisma that they bring to their office when they're in Canberra. But if you see this person away from Canberra, they're quite different. They're much more low energy, normal, not quite as enthusiastic, but when they're in the office, it's always really high energy, and that kind of lifts the people on their team around them. Some people might say, well, that's like, two-faced is a bit harsh, but they're not, they're sort of putting on something, but maybe that's what they need to do to get themselves in the headspace.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, if you think about it down to the things that influence us, now neurochemicals can be incredibly powerful. And if there's an agent, and let's call it Trump or another leader or someone that's stimulating the release of certain neurochemicals in you, like you're feeling happy, you're feeling trusting, you're feeling whatever, then whether you're really conscious of it or not and intellectualizing their words, like how people make you feel, there's a lot to do with that. So not everyone is joining the thoughtful, conscious information processing, analytical side of it, and actually digesting messages and critically evaluating their merit. Instead, they're and many people are working through default reactions that are being triggered by stimulus, and it's having an effect on us, and we're just rolling with the neurochemical wave that ensues.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we almost, like what Cam was talking about before, as an advisor, you might have to give some difficult advice, and it's very tricky. And also, Adrian, you mentioned as well, it's like, what happens if the advice isn't really welcomed? You run the risk of people not really wanting to work with you because you're just giving them bad news all the time. Then the flip side of that could be that you've got somebody who is really entertaining, great to be around, but maybe not always giving you the best advice. So and I imagine, there could be a powerful combination where somebody is not only quite credible and powerful, but also entertaining as well, and gets the attention as well as has the substance behind them.
And that's the thing, because anyone that is incomplete in achieving an outcome will have a use-by date. So people might have been overwhelmed with a leader that was delivering negative information. It was all risk and issue and problem and less about hope. And they get to a point of exhaustion with that style of leadership. And so they make a decision for that other thing. That looks more favorable. Even in the relationship space, which is arcing back to my relationship dissolution research in my honors year, comparison for alternatives was a key variable in whether or not you would dissolve a relationship. And it was like, if there weren't any alternatives, then you would stay. if there was an alternative and that looked favorable, then you might switch. And the same is true here. If we have a leader and it gets to the point where it's not fulfilling our needs and we compare and there's an alternative and it's like, oh, that's giving us some signals that things could be better than they are, then that can be the switch.
That's really interesting. I like the way you phrase the fact that it's a neurochemical reaction. It's funny how there's so many things around the human being which is kind of invisible. And that's the other thing. You don't get to see a reaction. You have to assume it and observe it indirectly. And imagine how powerful it would be if you could really visualize that information. And I guess that's what you're getting to around. Let's actually measure the human metrics. Let's find a way of doing that, because getting good data on and seeing changes in people and what actually works it could actually be quite powerful. Like if you measure, if you actually see it happening, then you might change tact.
Totally. And the one thing I want to quickly say, because I know that there was a big wave of neuro leadership and neuro this, and every study had a brain scan on it, and brains are far more complicated than to be reduced down to this variable did this on a brain scan. Amazing. Like it's not quite like that, but I actually think that if we look at physiology and we understand how physiology affects psychology rather than just these brain scans, now they do have merit, some of them, right? But I think, if we understand what's the imprint, what's being affected here, that's beyond just the expressed intellectual or evident psychological or behavioral, there's a broader human system that's being influenced here.
Yeah, I had this sort of a silly example. It's like there's so many medical things that you might attend to if you could see them. So like if your skin was transparent and you could see, your liver is not looking very good, you might go, oh, look what's happening there. But you just have to assume that maybe drinking too much or eating too much bad food is actually may or may not. It's invisible, so you can always have peace of mind that you don't have to look at it.
Yeah.
All the other way around. Like if your liver's doing okay, you might decide to start drinking more.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah. I also wonder as well, like just things like if trying to lose weight, those sorts of things. If there was a device in your pocket that was actually 100% accurate and it actually was telling you, this is how many fat cells you're creating by eating this, and it actually was going up every time you ate, you'd probably start to go, oh, right, I could actually just, put that down now. But there's a level of denial in not necessarily having something visible. And it's probably a nice convenience for many things, because we probably don't want to know everything anyway. And then what you're describing, Adrian, around, we measure something, we find something. There's a point at which even if you really wanted to make some changes, if you start finding lots and lots of problems, you start to go, gee, did I really need to go searching for these things? Everything seemed fine yesterday.
And it's funny.
Surely, like if we could measure everything all the time, we might just start looking at nothing else, and literally not living our lives.
And it's totally, analysis paralysis or whatever, right? But what I always want to caution is if people are jumping to conclusions, if they're just following that, you know what, there's a link between this and that. It's like, well, when you look at it a different way, the third variable problem, there's always going to be some other variable that's really important to model here that gives us a different point of view. And so I think just whether you have to analyze everything or at least just holding the space to not just buy everything that you see because it sounds compelling and it sounds like that silver bullet as an example, and you just want to have this is the fundamental paradox, actually, one of them of human beings. We have a craving for certainty, but we also have a need for novelty. So we want to be curious explorers, but we also want to feel confident. We want to trust something. We want to feel safe. And it's how do you work with the reality of that dance for a human being?
Well, indeed. And also we sometimes pursue things we think are going to make us happy as well. So we think we want more certainty, for example. We're not realizing that by doing the same thing over and over again, actually could be slowly making us feel less happy. Or we might think, oh, I need more novelty, not realizing that having a bit more structure and stability might be the very thing you need. I've been noticing, I've been trialing this ring, this measurement ring. You probably know, Adrian, the Aura ring, which it sounds like some new age mood ring, but it's it actually measures like heart rate and things like that. It's quite interesting. I'm not doing a product placement for that, of course. That's just it just happened to be using it.
Is it Amazon scroll across the bottom of the screen?
That's right.
By now.
But what's really interesting is that it does give you some, whether it's 100% accurate or not, it probably is not 100%, but it's probably not too bad. It does give you some good little sleep metrics, and it does tell you things like how rested you should feel and all of that. And it seems to, on face validity, it seems to do it quite well. But some of the things I noticed with it were things like just the consistency of a sleep schedule, which it's something I've never really paid huge attention to. Like I've always kind of gone, all right, look, I'll go to bed around a certain time, but if I go to bed an hour later one night and half an hour earlier another night, then who really cares? It couldn't make that much of a difference. But what you learn from wearing this over time is that if you do stabilize your pattern of sleep, then you get a better quality sleep over time. Now, you might go, well, I'm not going to spend my life, as Kevin pointed out, measuring all this stuff. I want to live my life, so I don't want to be living my life by this ring on my finger. But there are some things you just don't know unless you do measure, like things like that, little, that you could actually be really making your life a lot better if you are more consistent with your sleep. But you don't ever discover that because you've never done it before.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one because I've got a similar example, and this is probably what's going to happen with you, Nick, that you wear the Oura Ring for a while, you get some real value out of it, and to the conversation we were just having, it brings something that was invisible and makes it visible, and then you're able to make some choices and see the effect of those. And I had a similar thing. Now, I'm a driven, often up in my head kind of guy, and I can tend towards the stress side, and I've got an appreciation for what the science tells us about stress, that it's not all bad, and so I get that at one level, and I believe that some stress is really helpful for us and it challenges us, and some stress is debilitating. But I was curious about the effect that my experience of stressing was having on me physiologically, and so I actually got an early version of a stress monitor, a wearable patch, and I was able to look at times throughout the day and physiologically what state my nervous system was in and how depleted I was getting from being in certain states over time. And it was really powerful for me to actually see, you know what? Even at the peak times where I could have easily said to myself, geez, I'm stressed, I recognized that physiologically I was actually just in a highly challenged zone, but not wearing myself out. And so for me, that was really valuable. Like, so different to a routine, it was more, hey, shit, that's changed my mind a bit about the nature of how I work and what states I'm in and what I tell myself about those states.
Yeah, I felt that way many years ago when I wore the pedometer, where everyone was wearing them at one stage, and I was like, oh, I'm going to get my walking up. And then I got to a point where I was like, I just knew how much I was walking based on the time. And I was like, I don't need this anymore. It's just, it's not really giving me much difference. I now been educated about the fact that I should be getting up off my desk more often. And I could just go for a 20-minute walk. If I did that a few times a day, and it doesn't take very long, then all of a sudden you're actually, getting a lot of exercise, and you don't feel it because it's
and you don't create a dependency on the metric. You're not now obsessed with needing to achieve or needing to get better than your previous. Anyway, there's benefits to
I went hiking with some friends recently, and it's something I usually do by myself, and they had a really different approach to it. So they were using the app and not only like clocking their distance, but also like, how long it was taking them each kilometer and things like that. And then first of all, I really resented that because my approach to hiking is sort of like much more meandering. Like, so if I see something interesting, I'll stop and go and have a look at it. So it doesn't matter if I'm at a certain pace, but I did find it, I did like knowing later on, like I went and did the same hike and worked out like how far a certain hike actually was and like roughly how long it took me. But I found like I wanted to be able to take it or leave it. It wasn't that important to me that I could do the whole thing in 3 hours and 30 minutes as opposed to 5 hours, whatever it might be.
I had a colleague at quite a few years ago now, where we're doing, I think everyone was wearing these pedometers. I think we got free ones at work or something. And she was really dedicated to it, and she was really like crestfallen because she'd done all this exercise but forgot to wear her pedometer, and so she was like, "Oh, I didn't get to register it on the system." It gets to a point where it gets a bit silly, doesn't it? Where it's and I don't know what it means.
I've seen the same people in Strava saying, yeah, and then the battery died, but I actually did this.
Yeah. Adrian, thanks for joining us today. It was really interesting. I think really every time we catch up and we have a discussion about well-being, I think you're like the aura ring for me, because it reminds me about looking after my own well-being. So I sort of think, man, that's actually right. I really should be paying closer attention to some of these things myself. So I think the last time I heard you speak, I was like sitting there going, yeah, there's a few things on that list there I could do way more often, and I've really got to start paying closer attention to it. So maybe it'll wear off on me in the future at some stage.
Yeah,
good.
I really
Thanks,
enjoyed it,
man.
Adrian. Thank you.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks for having me. See you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Adrian. See you later. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Enjoy Byron.
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay, so that was Dr. Adrian Medhurst.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Now, Cam, you're now moving on to a completely different topic, or perhaps it isn't. Maybe it is something to do with leadership. There
are parallels to leadership, actually. Maybe not so much well-being in leadership, but yeah. Do you have one before I talk about something I've been watching?
Yes, well, I'm watching a new series. I got through Ratched the other day.
Oh, yes.
That was good. I really enjoyed that. It didn't get very good reviews, and I don't know why. I really liked it, but there's another one I'm watching. I'm just trying to get the name. One second. It's a new show on Netflix called The Haunting of Bly Manor. Have you seen that one pop up on Netflix?
No, I haven't. I'm jotting it down. So it's like a series?
Yeah, well, there was one last year called The Haunting of Hill House, which is very popular. Yeah, that was very good as well. This one is not, it's not a sequel to that, but it's made by the same people and it's got the same actors in it. And that's actually become a very, I don't know if you've noticed, it's a very common thing to do now, like especially on Netflix. I think a lot of
American
actors.
Horror Story does that, obviously, and there are others, aren't there? Yeah.
Yeah, there are, and you sort of, this whole model has changed a lot, hasn't it? Because they've got actors now who sign up to these streaming services and basically sign up for a certain number of television shows and movies. So like...
so is that how that works? I didn't actually realize that. It's almost like the old Hollywood studio system, like going right back to the 20s, 30s, 40s kind of thing.
Well, it's quite fascinating when you think about COVID-19 has probably just solidified the popularity of streaming services. Everyone's in using them, and a lot of people, I don't think this is the case, because I think everyone's always trying to say that some industry is going to die. For instance, when movies and television came along, people said, when people are going to stop going to the theatre and they're going to stop going to live events. And of course, that's not true. They're as popular as, maybe not as popular as they used to be, but they're popular in another way. So people go to these live events and will spend big money on tickets, as an example. But the streaming, I don't think movies will go away. Like a lot of people saying the cinema's going to die because of COVID, and I think some of them will go out of business. But I think people like going to the movies, and you can never really replicate the experience in the home.
I think
even with the home cinema.
I'm fascinated by what the future of cinema will be, and also the future of film on the streaming services, because I know at the moment a movie that goes straight to, say, Netflix isn't eligible for an Academy Award, right? And I suspect that may have to change. I don't think that's tenable in 5-10 years, frankly. Like, there could be a really good film that gets debuted directly on streaming, so why should that be excluded from consideration? Yeah.
I do worry though that if movies at least die out, or at least if most of it goes to streaming, that the quality might drop because of the production costs. Because there's a big there's a whole mechanism around getting these movies developed in the marketing and getting them into the cinemas and generate, they some of the big blockbusters and big films that you go to the cinema to see, whether they'll still exist on streaming services.
Yeah, no, I wonder that too. Like, I think there's certain kinds of film that really only work in the cinema, or they work much better in the cinema, right? You're not necessarily going to want to see them, at least for the first time, on streaming. So I don't think it's going to be a case where you only go to the cinema to see an IMAX style sort of, big screen sort of experience. But I suspect, like, I don't know, the last movie I saw at the cinema was Tenet, and which was good, and I'm glad I saw it at the cinema. Like I'm sure I'll rewatch it when it comes out on streaming, but it was a good cinema experience.
Yeah, well, I think those are the sort of movies that will still be very popular, because definitely those big Christopher Nolan type films, perhaps those big superhero blockbuster films, but then there's this other type of as well, isn't there? The old kind of cinematic films that are kind of the art house type ones, which feel better in the cinema for some reason than they do on television. Yeah,
I've noticed. So in Canberra, cinemas are actually open. They're not getting huge crowds, but there's a lack of content for cinemas. So they're showing what little movies are available, but they're also re-showing a lot of old movies. Movies going back only say 5 years, but also movies going right back, to when we were kids, but also back to the classic era of Hollywood as well. So that's kind of cool in a way, like to know that you can go and see all sorts of things in that setting. Yeah.
So what are you? So you were telling me you're watching a Netflix show, something on the challenge, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm watching. I'm 2 episodes in, so it's a 4-part like doco series called Challenger: The Final Flight, and it's I don't know. It's directed or produced by J.J. Abrams, and it's obviously the story of the 1986 Challenger shuttle disaster and space shuttle, and it's always something I've had an interest in. I don't know if it's the same for you, but it's one of my earliest memories of a world event. So I was like 5 years old, almost 6, when it happened, and I can remember one of the treats I would occasionally get after my swimming lessons would be I would get to go to Red Rooster sometimes, and the meals at this stage were in a plastic container in the shape of a space shuttle. And so the sort of the 1980s were, the era of the space shuttle, and obviously Challenger ended in disaster. And so the documentary is partly the story of that. But it's not just like an episode of air crash investigation. Like it does go through investigation, but it also tells you the story of the crew and of the program more broadly. So you might remember that episode of The Simpsons where Homer Simpson goes into space, right? And NASA's rationale behind that was we want ordinary people to go into space. And, Homer and Barney were obviously like the most ordinary, brain dead slobs, I think they called them, that they could find. Well, there was a little bit of truth to that. So in the 80s, there was a bit of exhaustion with the space program, in the sense that NASA had been to the moon. They'd done some really amazing things. It was kind of like, what next? So the space shuttle program kind of emerged as this way to almost democratize space travel. This is like way before SpaceX and things like that. And put ordinary scientists up in space, and then put school teachers up in space. So Ronald Reagan announced this competition for school teachers to enter, put their case forward, and to be the first school teacher in space. And that's partly the story of Challenger. And I'll probably check back in on this one next week, and it'll probably have a bit more focus on the sadder side of things, because it gets to the leadership side of it obviously is there were whistleblowers and things going wrong, people drawing their attention to things going wrong within the program leading up to Challenger, and they were ignored in various ways. So I guess that that obviously speaks to leadership, and why was it ignored?
Yeah. Do you think with these sorts of cases that if you were to look at all the successful ones as well, whether there were also whistleblowers or people raising concerns, but you never really hear much about them because it was successful in the end? So I sometimes wonder, is it was it that there was, and I'm familiar with the Challenger incident, I've gone to workshops where they've deconstructed them, and obviously there was lots of failures, leadership ones and ones around the scheduling and
scheduling and budget, right, and sort of meeting those performance targets.
But I mean, it's kind of like I think, I'm not sure if I gave this example in one of the other podcasts, but I remember doing some research at railway level crossings. I mentioned that to you, like where you go, let's say, and someone was saying, if we just look at where we've had all of the people who've been hit by a train, so let's say in Victoria, there's hundreds of level crossings between road and rail. If we just look at all the ones where we've had incidents, we'll be able to record all of the problems, all of the characteristics of those locations, and then we'll be able to determine that there's a particular profile that fits them. So, for example, it might be that there's a curve in the road as you're approaching, or there could be, unclear signs, or there could be all these things, right? And so I started looking at the data, and I was like, well, you can't really do that because, well, you can do it, but you also got to look at where you don't have the crashes, because you might find those characteristics are at those locations as well. So if you find that, yes, 50 of those crossings had a curve in the road just before the crossing, you might go, well, there you go, there's the pattern. But if you look at the other, say, 500, and you see there's a curve in the road in 100 of those, and they didn't have any crashes, then you'd have to go, well, it's not really a pattern at all, is there? It's like looking at some...
I mean, even in the episode last night, they described the disaster as a lot of things had to go wrong at the same time for that to happen. So, statistically, it was probably in some ways a freak event. And
the Apollo mission as well, the first one, not the first one, but it's the one where they sent, Neil Armstrong up. But which one was that? Was that Apollo? I can't remember.
Yes, it was. It was one of the early Apollos, right? I'm getting my number. The one that went wrong was obviously Apollo 13, right? The one that they made the Tom Hanks movie.
That's right.
They got them back to Earth. So my understanding is until '86 and Challenger happened, they'd never lost anyone.
That's right. But if you look at that mission, the first one, they were basically the space race, as they called them. Now, you can imagine another universe, another parallel universe, where that Apollo mission failed, and there was a documentary released 50 years later saying, well, it was all due to racing the Russians to space, and that's what caused it. But
that's absolutely right. I mean, good old JFK gave that speech, I think, in 1960, saying we'd put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and they did it with about 6 months to spare. I think they were obviously, driving hard to do that. And I mean, that's a backdrop. The politics, in a sense, is a backdrop to this. So 1986, the Cold War was still going on, and Reagan's, America was very much in this arms race with the Soviets, and they were, trying to prove to the Soviets that they were better and stronger and faster and all that sort of thing. And there was a TV ratings element to this as well. Like NASA was sort of worried that people were losing interest in the space program. So it's
like the Simpsons episode.
In fact, there's a lot of elements of truth in that sort of episode. What I find interesting now is that we are starting, I mean, people were never completely absent from space, I don't think, since we started going there, but it has moved away from that in some ways, because we know now that through using AI, we can go a lot further into space, obviously, because you don't have to worry about a human lifespan, if you're traveling, hundreds of or thousands of light years into space. But there still is that need to have a human element. So we're looking at putting people on Mars. I think China's working towards putting their first astronaut on the moon. So there still is that sort of need for humans to be in space.
Well, indeed, because you could theoretically, I guess, you could send a satellite up there. I think they've sent the Voyager probe, and then they've sent those sorts of things up into space.
And that's right. And also, like, the shuttle program wasn't all about prestige. I mean, they were doing real work up there. They were placing satellites, I think, and servicing satellites that went on to create like the GPS system as we know it. So there are real tangible benefits to it.
Have you do you ever take an interest in the Idiot Abroad, Carl Pilkington, the series?
Yeah.
There's a great, there's a good, before podcasts became really popular, there was like a radio show which you can watch on YouTube.
Oh yeah, that's right, the original, yeah.
Yeah,
There's a
XFM.
TV series, I'm more familiar with that, but it started as a pod, right? Or before, even pre-pod.
Yeah, it was. Well, I think it was. Also, Ricky Gervais, Stephen Merchant, and Carl Pilkington was their producer, who basically was the person behind the scenes pressing the buttons, and they just kept asking him questions because he was a funny sort of character, and eventually he became the star of the show, essentially, because he was so funny.
Yeah.
But he certainly, one of the things he observed was that what was the point of sending people up to space? What did they do? They just drove around in the buggy and looked at some rocks. It didn't really do anything, did it?
That's why it looked so cool. In fact, there was an interesting aside on the doco last night. There was a clip of a very young Jerry Seinfeld. This is like pre-Seinfeld show, doing some stand-up, sort of having a crack at the space program and saying, well, they're sending up anyone now, that the person they should send up is the guy who doesn't want to be there. They need to like get someone who's kicking and screaming, like, literally not wanting to get into the astronaut suit, and send that person up.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly the premise for an Idiot Abroad. They send poor old Carl around the world to countries that he just has no interest in at all. He goes to see the pyramids, and he's not impressed at all by the pyramids. He gets sick everywhere he goes. He hates the food. He hates the cultures, and he returns. Basically not an improved person.
Not having learned anything or like changed his life at all. So it's a complete opposite of like what we think travel's meant to do for us.
Yeah, well, what I like about his travel shows, which is the Idiot Abroad series, is it actually highlights a lot of the travel shows, really about celebrating other parts of the world. But this one is actually, when you think about it, is actually putting the spotlight on all of the things that we hate about travel.
Yeah.
And that the things that we forget about when we go on a holiday, and when afterwards we look at the photos and think, oh, that was great. We had that lovely dinner, or we went out. Oh, that was fantastic views. But we often don't stop and think about, oh, remember we stood in that line at the airport for a really long time, or
absolutely.
Or when we were away and it rained those 2 days and we didn't have anything to do, or
that's right. And sitting on the tarmac and you may be getting food poisoning, or there's all these sort of off bits of travel, so to speak. Couples often argue on holiday because they have a kind of heightened expectation of what the experience should be, perhaps. And there's a really good sketch on Saturday Night Live when Adam Sandler went back and did a guest spot. I think it was last year, and he plays this Italian-American tour guide, right, who's taking sort of New York suburban tour groups to Italy. And he says, we can take you to a vineyard, but we can't change the reason why you drink. We can take you on a hike, but we can't make you like hiking. Like, you're basically going to be the same people in Tuscany as you are in Brooklyn or wherever you're from. And I think that sort of speaks to something really interesting about, we kind of sometimes expect to be our better selves when we're on holidays.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? And you know what as well? I would also imagine that if you're the sort of person who is saying to themselves, I have to have a particular experience, that might also take away from it as well, instead of just, because it's not really experience if you're demanding it of itself. You're demanding the experience to happen. So if you go along saying to yourself, I'm going to go off to this winery and I'm going to have a fantastic, relaxing time no matter what. And you're probably setting yourselves up for failure. And it's I remember there was a clinical psychologist I knew who was saying, he made a really interesting comment about sleep, and he was saying, sleep and relaxation, but he was saying that you can't relax by sitting there clenching your fists, saying to yourself, just relax, damn it, relax.
No, that's right.
We can't will it to happen. And I like that idea. It's like you can rock up on the day, but if your mind is not in the right place, then you will not enjoy yourself, and you will spend the whole time over analyzing it. In fact, that probably connects with what we said to Adrian before, what we were discussing around if we're obsessed with measuring everything constantly, then what are we actually doing? Are we living our lives at all?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, on that note, we might wrap up.
All right. Great discussion as always. Till next time, Dr. Dark.
Catch you later. Bye.